Now that we've explored the framework of a life cycle assessment under ISO standard 14040, let's take a look at the executive details using the sister standard, ISO 14044. If you haven't seen the video where we discuss ISO 14040, you may want to pause here and visit that video. It's only about 10 minutes long, and it may help contextualize some of the things we discuss in this video. So let's revisit some of the things we looked at in ISO 14040 when it comes to LCAs, but from a requirements and guidelines perspective. ISO 14044 mirrors 14040 in the way it approaches the structure of an LCA. In fact, the document starts with a brief overview of the principles and framework of an LCA. You may recognize these two elements as comprising the content of the ISO 14040 standard document. So again, we're seeing that joint approach to LCAs, where the workload of laying out just what it is and how it works is shared between the two standards. We also get introduced to the concept of a life cycle inventory study, or LCI study. We'll talk about this in more detail in a future video, but essentially at this stage an LCI study can be viewed as almost the same as a life cycle assessment, an LCA, only it does not include an impact assessment phase. If we look at our familiar LCA framework, we can see that the name Life Cycle Inventory Study sort of makes sense in this way. In any case, this brief catch-up comprises the general requirements section of ISO 14044. The standard then moves on to cover all of the LCA phases we became familiar with when looking at ISO 14040. So let's revisit them one by one. The first stop is the goal and scope definition phase, and I'm just going to get this out of the way right now so you don't have to listen to me repeating myself for every single phase. We need to remember that LCAs are iterative processes. This means we may need to revisit phases once they're done, so to speak, making adjustments or refinements or even total revisions as the study progresses. The goal and scope definition phase is no different in this way. We may define them now only to have to redefine them a couple of weeks or a couple of months from now. So what was this phase? Let's recall. The goal is, why are we expending all this effort and resources? What do we hope to accomplish with this study? And the scope is, how deep into detail do we go? What do we need to know? What can we ignore? ISO 14044 tells us that the goal should be stated unambiguously. This is both for the benefit of those carrying out the assessment and those who will receive the results. It makes sure that everyone is on the same page. A well-stated goal will include the following details for everyone's benefit: the intended application of the study, and, hand in hand with that, the reasons for carrying it out in the first place. The intended audience. Is it corporate? Is it the public? Is it private interests? This can affect what exactly we examine. An especially important detail is whether the results are to be used in comparative assertions intended to be released to the public. This is a specifically crafted phrase that pops up a lot in these standards, and for good reason. If the results of an LCA will be used to say to the general public, this process or this product is better than this other one, this opens the door to all sorts of questions of vested interest, data integrity, the list goes on. So when an LCA, I'll say it again, when an LCA's results are to be used in comparative assertions intended to be released to the public, special considerations are due. And the first place you should make the reader aware of this condition is right up front in the goal and scope. So now let's talk about the scope in some more detail. ISO 14044 states that the scope should be clearly delineated. Much like the goal, it's a good idea to start with a general idea of what you want to accomplish, then inform your procedure by following the details provided by ISO in the standard. In this case, the details you should be reporting in the scope include the following: your product system that's under study, that's basic. The system boundary, these two are closely related, of course. Then you have the functions of the product system and the functional unit of the study. Again, these two are closely related. allocation procedures. How are you dealing with intermediate flows? How are you handling inputs and outputs at the boundary between LCA phases? We'll talk a bit more about allocation in just a second with the inventory phase. In fact, the list goes on. What we've listed so far are sort of the high-level considerations for the scope. Many of the other details we will define in the scope relate to the different LCA phases individually, and we'll revisit these concepts in a future video in quite a bit more detail. Now, keep in mind, some of these considerations are clearly more involved than others, and some of them may not apply to your situation at all. You will need to be discriminate in your choices so that you don't end up with a scope that's either too overblown or not detailed enough to cover what you need to study. Also, you might recognize some of the jargon in that list. Functional unit, system boundary. There's others too, value choices, critical review, others too. Some of these terms we've seen before, some of them we haven't. Don't worry about it just now. There will be a video in this series dedicated to the specialized vocabulary we use when doing LCAs. And we'll take the time to break down each of these concepts in an intuitive way so we don't get lost. So, our next phase is the first executive phase of the LCA, the Life Cycle Inventory Analysis, or LCI phase. This is as good a place as any to throw up this disclaimer. The LCI phase is not the same as an LCI study. Let me use some graphics here to explain because this is a common source of confusion. Remember, an LCI study, for our purposes right now, is an LCA study, just without an impact assessment phase. The impact assessment phase is also called the LCIA phase. That's the phase that comes next. The phase we're on now is the LCI phase, the inventory analysis phase. The LCI phase is a part of both LCA studies and LCI studies. The LCIA phase is not a part of the LCI study. Super straightforward, right? Don't worry, these are things we will keep addressing as we move forward because we really don't want to get lost in the details or the jargon. For now, the inventory phase, the LCI phase. We won't cover all of the details here because there is a lot of them. Full details for each phase we talk about today will be saved for a dedicated video, one for each phase, from the perspectives of both standards, 14040 and 14044, to get that comprehensive view of each of them. But here's an overview from the perspective of ISO 14044, just for now. Remember that this is an iterative process, and we might have to loop back here to the inventory if we hit a wall later on in the study. First, we deal with the raw data. We prepare for data collection by building proper models and collection techniques. Then we actually go and collect the data. Then we try to validate it. We ask ourselves, can we relate this data to our unit process? How about to our functional unit? It's at this point we might need to aggregate our data or else break it down even further to accomplish the goal of the study according to its scope. We may also need to refine the system boundary and start again if we find that our data isn't useful for what we're trying to achieve. This may mean that we need to refine our data collection techniques. ISO 14044 actually provides some helpful templates for creating a data collection sheet if you're having trouble aligning the inputs and outputs of your product system with the goals of your LCA. As you're collecting data, you'll certainly want to consider classifying them under some major headings. This can include the following. Major inputs. This includes energy inputs, raw material inputs, ancillary inputs, and other physical product inputs. Major outputs. This includes your desired products, but also byproducts, co-products, and any waste or scrap material. Emissions and releases to air, water, and soil. This can include your traditional pollution or other externalities like excessive noise, light, or vibration. Finally, a category for other environmental aspects you'd want to consider over the course of your study. Within these headings, you should also subcategorize each input and output and align each subcategory with a particular part of the unit process or a particular role within the functional unit. We also need to talk briefly about the concept of allocation. This is a practice that has some nuance to it, and we're going to revisit it in a later video. For now, though, we can say that allocation is how we assign different inputs and outputs to different products according to a given set of procedures. For example, you make hammers. You need some wood for the handles, you need some metal for the heads, and maybe some plastic for the packaging. So these three inputs, wood, metal, and plastic, they get allocated to certain procedures, and they will have corresponding outputs that you would expect on the other end of those processes. So we're making hammer handles, for example. The input is your raw lumber, maybe some heat, maybe some electricity, maybe some various chemicals. Our output is not the hammer, but the handle. So we've allocated the input of raw lumber to the process of handle making. We'll have data to back this up, of course, transport costs, amount of wood needed per hammer in accordance with your functional unit, right? But the point is, by allocating the raw lumber to the process of making handles, we have accounted for that input. We have recognized the output, in this case the hammer handle, and we can then allocate that material to another process. Same with the metal, same with the plastic, same with every input and output within your product system. The two main goals of allocation are accountability and completeness. We are ensuring that every part of the process of making that hammer is recognized and detailed, and that nothing is getting left out of the overall equation. This is encapsulated by the golden rule of allocation. The sum total of your inputs and outputs after allocation should equal their sum total before you've allocated them. Nothing should be lost, nothing should be passed over. Everything gets accounted for. It seems straightforward, but we will revisit allocation in the future to talk about some of its finer points. Now, that was the LCI phase, the inventory phase. Let us now move on to the life cycle impact assessment phase, the LCIA. I'll drop the standard reminder that this is a relative approach, and so it will differ from other environmental impact or assessment techniques that you may be used to. The LCIA should be carefully planned to achieve the goal of the LCA within its scope. How do we do that? How does this phase fit into the overall framework? Well, it's coordinated with the other phases to account for possible omissions and sources of uncertainty. One such source is when data or inputs or outputs or whatever, when these items are handled indirectly. Think about the allocations that we just discussed in the LCI phase, where we sort of define an avenue for the resource and say, yes, this is how we assume it gets used up, this is the proportion we feel represents the usage. Right? And we can collect a great amount of detail and spend a lot of time modeling this resource usage. But a lot of the time, our final metric might very well be an approximation. That means there's a potential to lose some of that precision in your data at this point. We need to account for that. Some other similar sources of uncertainty might be when you aggregate data or when you have a system-wide averaging process. These things might be required by the data you collect, but they need to be accounted for, and that transparency starts in the LCIA, at least in part. Another source of uncertainty might be the quality of the data you collect in the LCI phase, and whether the results are sufficient to conduct the LCIA in accordance with the goal and scope of the study. You may find that it's not, and due to the iterative nature of the LCA, this is the point where you would stop the LCIA phase and return to the LCI to try and get that more relevant data to complete your study. There are, of course, other sources of uncertainty, and we'll cover them in more detail in the dedicated LCIA video later in this video series. But what about the LCIA itself? What does it look like? ISO 14044 defines the LCIA phase by listing some mandatory elements that your LCA should include. Without listing each and every one of them in detail, you can expect to include the three following classes of elements. First, your selection of impact categories, category indicators, and characterization models. Basically, these assign numerical data based on the functional unit. This is the data that we got from the inventory. And we assign it to an environmental mechanism in a standardized way, using categories, indicators, and models. We'll explore this process more in future videos because it's too important to just kind of gloss over in an overview video like this one, so we'll return to it. Secondly, which classifications you've come up with for your LCI results. We talked a bit about this in the last phase. This is essentially where we assign our LCI results to selected impact categories. For results spanning multiple categories, we look at whether we apportion the results into distinct categories or assign them to mechanisms directly. This determines whether we classify our results as belonging to parallel or series mechanisms. Again, we'll get into more detail later on. Now, classification goes hand in hand with selection that we just discussed. And at a later time, we will break it down into more detail in that perspective. Finally, the calculation of category indicator results, which is also called characterization. This is another pretty technical process that basically involves converting your LCI results into common units and aggregating them within similar and relevant subcategories. The outcome of this process is a numerical indicator result, and this result will give you a metric for starting to identify potential impacts resulting from your product system. Now, anytime you're boiling data down in this way to give a metric that represents a set of data, you've got to expect variation, you've got to expect trade-offs, and you've got to expect issues with the accuracy and the precision of the results. These are things that ISO 14044 handles pretty extensively. In fact, there are separate sections for data handling before and after you characterize it. We will explore the process in more detail at a later time in the dedicated video. Finally, just briefly, we have some optional elements and minor details that you can include in the LCIA if it makes things clearer or easier for your target audience. These are usually data-related operations like weighting, grouping, and normalization. These provide flexibility in the execution of the LCA, as well as facilitating certain parts of the assessment that might not be as relevant to your goal and scope. However, because these processes can change the conclusions we draw from the LCIA phase, we need to present the choices we make, along with the rationale for making these choices and any consequences that we predict as a result of those choices. The third and final LCA executive phase is the interpretation phase, and it comprises several elements. First and foremost, we interpret what we have produced. We identify the significant issues of the study based on the results of the previous two phases, the LCI and LCIA phases. Secondly, we should consider concrete metrics for completeness, data sensitivity, and procedural consistency. This is another point at which we stop and make sure that the way we are conducting the LCA meets the principles set forth in the sister standard ISO 14040 that we explored in an earlier video. Finally, this is the phase where we start forming some of our conclusions and recognizing some of our limitations and maybe even thinking about some recommendations for moving forward when the study is complete. You'll notice that this phase, the interpretation phase, works with the goal and scope definition to frame the LCA study. On the other hand, the LCI and the LCIA phases produce the information we're looking for about the product system. Thinking about the LCA in this kind of way can kind of help to further contextualize what it is we're doing. And once again, this phase will get a full breakdown in a dedicated video. But for now, there are three major points we should look at in the context of ISO 14044. First is the identification of significant issues. Using the data from the LCI and LCIA phases, we can ask ourselves the question, what are the major elements affecting my product system to which I now know I need to pay closer attention? This can be something like high transport costs, or high waste emissions, or maybe it's a positive, like a net zero resource process that you weren't able to identify before. A major part of the interpretation phase is just listing and categorizing the major findings in a coherent way. Secondly, evaluation of the LCA itself, and this plays into the iterative nature of the study. This can be quite an extensive process, and there's a handful of recommendations for carrying it out, like questions you should ask yourself or perspectives you should adopt, certain lenses through which you should view this part of the study. Essentially, however, we just want to make sure that the study we performed, the effort we just expended to arrive at this data set or these data sets, the execution itself is complete and consistent. Finally, after completing at least the first iteration of the interpretation phase, we should be able to start drawing some conclusions. These conclusions are not only about the product system itself. For example, the data about our product says ABC and therefore we should do XYZ. You may want these kinds of conclusions, don't get me wrong, but these are not the only conclusions we should be looking for. We should, again, also be examining the LCA itself and think about not only what we were able to find, but what we're not able to find. What are the limitations of our LCA in this respect? So we want to develop recommendations not only for what we should do with the product system once the study is complete, but also what we should be able to recognize that we don't know, what we weren't able to assess, problems we weren't able to solve. This will help us reapply the study on the next phase iteration or inform future studies if we've reached the end of this period's analytical process. Now, the critical review and reporting phases also receive coverage in the ISO 14044 standard, and they will also receive a dedicated video shared between both of the two phases since they sort of go hand in hand with the end of the study, as it were. The reporting phase is broken into two major compulsory components, and one optional component. The optional component is easy to describe, so let's tackle it first. If your LCA is intended for producing comparative assertions intended for public disclosure, there is a separate part of your report that must be generated. Remember, this is an important subcondition that ISO 14040 and 14044 address specifically because of the nature of the claims that it can create. So if this applies to your LCA, make extra certain that you cover yourself on this front. Now, the first compulsory component is the set of general requirements. This lists all of the things that should be reported out of the data collected in the study. Now, of course, it's not to say that every LCA will be reporting out of exactly the same requirements. A product system for a light bulb manufacturer just won't look the same as that of, say, a car wash. That being said, there are broad categories for reporting that most LCAs should be able to generate something within. These include the raw data in some form, the methods and models that you used, and then some LCA-specific reporting that closely relates the methodology of the study to your product system. For example, you should be reporting your system boundary, your unit processes, your impact categories, and your category indicators. Again, this is a lot of jargon. It will make more sense when we look at a glossary of LCA terms in the future. The second compulsory component of the reporting phase consists of additional requirements for third-party reporting. Sometimes the data you collect will require external validation or external verification by experts who deal with the sort of data associated with your product. Let's take that car wash, for example, a busy one with a dozen bays that might see 100 customers daily for a dozen different services. Trying to track something like energy usage relative to water consumption. This might not be the easiest thing for the owner of the car wash to accomplish. They may need to send their raw data on to someone else. And if this is the case, there's a host of additional requirements that can apply to your study. And they're subcategorized with respect to the phases of the LCA. What this means is, if you subcontract an expert to deal with any part of your LCA, then not only are they responsible for taking that data and producing a conclusion, they must also engage with the phases they involve themselves with on a deeper level. And the ISO 14044 standard provides guidelines and recommendations for doing so. Future details will follow in a future video. And finally, the critical review phase is the most formal point in the study for metacognition. In other words, this is the part of the study where you evaluate the study. We talked about this concept a bit in the other phases, especially in the context of ensuring your results are aligning with the goal and scope of the study. The critical review phase is more heavily concerned with concepts like transparency. Are you fully explaining all of the models you're using and all of the assumptions that you've made? Things like consistency. Have you used the same units and volumes and sources and prices and vectors across your entire study? Have all of your allocated inputs and outputs been accounted for completely, or have they sort of dropped off the radar? Is your data not only complete enough, but also relevant to the goal of the study while staying within the scope? Are we collecting the right kind of data? Is the data we're getting reasonable? These are all the sorts of questions that we ask in the critical review phase. And similar to the reporting phase, there are also additional guidelines present for reviews carried out by internal or external experts. There's also an additional section, and that one deals with reviews conducted by panels of interested parties, for example, a board of executives or a collection of stakeholders. Sometimes these parties may want to weigh in on the LCA process, and ISO 14044 provides a framework from which to do so if that's indeed what your study calls for. Well, this video on ISO 14044 saw a fair bit more detail than the video for ISO 14040. This was kind of expected, right? We're not just talking about what is an LCA anymore. It's not just why have we decided to do this? Now it's how do we do this, right? What is the correct way? What are the questions we need to ask? What are the guidelines for reviewing our methods in a clear and coherent way? How can I make this report accessible to people who want to read it? Now, we still haven't touched on absolutely everything, but I hope by this point, having looked at both standards in some detail now, you're feeling much more confident about LCAs and how they work. Our next video together will be a bit different. It's designed to grab that feeling of confidence and expand it even bigger. Next video, we will take a short break from procedure and structure, and we will take the time to explore some LCA-specific terminology. We've been throwing around some terms like system boundary and impact category, functional unit, without fully explaining them. These are regular sounding words, but in the context of LCA, they mean something very specific. We've just been sort of hand-wavy, think of it like this or this, but we really can't do that anymore. If we want to continue moving forward, these are important concepts and they should be treated with the gravity they deserve. I hope to see you next time when we can explore these special terms in a bit more detail. I hope the video helps to erase much of the confusion you might still be feeling after the two videos about the standards, ISO 14040 and 14044. And I hope that once we've climbed that hill and reached that milestone together, we can really start picking apart the LCA, phase by phase, with lots of confidence in what we're talking about, and really start to understand the power of this environmental management tool. Stick around, because it's going to be amazing. I'm Jamie Friend-Ocumbo with Enviropass. Thanks for watching.